race, conversations, and law enforcement. This is Moses' People Speak. Welcome to another episode of Moses' People Speak. I am your host, Terry Watson, the founder of the Battle with Moses People. When I first came up with the idea of doing these webisodes, Moses' People Speak, it was because of the question I constantly received from my speaking engagement, The Battle with Moses People. That question is simple. How come law enforcement of color refuse to speak out on injustice? I would respond, they do. You just don't hear about them. But what happened when they do just that? Well, our guest today, Ms. Monica Blake, is a retired police officer who can speak to just that. Here is Monica's story.
A Metro police officer who favors having a community oversight board claims she's getting attacked by other officers on social media because of it, despite seeking help from her department. She tells News Channel 5's Brandon Marshall she is suing higher-ups to hold someone accountable.
In part of this lawsuit, the Metro officer claims some current and former Metro officers are attacking her for supporting the Community Oversight Board. She says her First and 14th Amendment rights are being violated. 14-year Metro Police veteran Monica Blake said she joined the force to fight crime and protect victims getting harassed. But lately, after harassment allegations within the department, she needs help of her own.
There were several different instances where I believe there was racial discrimination involved, and when I tried to report those things, they fell on deaf ears.
Blake gained access to a private Facebook group where current and retired officers allegedly attacked her for openly advocating for a community oversight board. The board would investigate police misconduct allegations. In the private group, one person wrote, "She's been defending this crap since day one." Another called her support sickening.
I cried a lot. It's painful and it's hurtful because in this entire race, the only thing that I have done was fought to stand up for what's right and fought to stand up for justice.
Part of Metro's social media policy says officers should not engage in any online communications that could reflect negatively on the department or its members. Blake claims the group felt she broke the blue code of silence, an unspoken rule among officers to never report on an officer's misconduct. She says she chose legal action, then filed a department complaint because she does not believe anything will get done.
This blue code of silence has gotten to the point where it's not just affecting police officers. It's now beginning to affect the public, and that's a problem.
The officer and her attorney want justice and believe higher-ups need to be held accountable. In Nashville, Brandon Marshall, News Channel 5.
Thank you, Brandon. We did reach out to the Metro Police Department, but we're told they cannot comment on any pending litigation. If you would like to read the entire lawsuit, we have it posted on newschannel5.com.
Monica, thank you for your time.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Monica, one of the things I must say is we had a conversation before, and I was like I mentioned before, I read your story, and I also watched that news video that I just showed everyone, and again I was sort of speechless about sort of your story. Let's start. Where are you from, Monica?
So I'm from a small town in Tennessee called Tullahoma, Tennessee, but I've been in Nashville for nearly 20 years. So I've stayed here since I went to college and graduated in 2004 and just been here ever since.
Wow. And so let me ask you, what was it that made you enter law enforcement?
So when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do career-wise, I thought about what had I been trained in at that time. And at that time, I had done a little bit of lobbying for gay and lesbian advocates and defenders. I had also done, I completed a double major in political science and English. So I was well versed in the law. I knew how the government worked. And I wanted to do something where I could help victims of crime. For most of my life, I've always felt very empathetic to people who did not have a voice, who needed a voice. So I wanted to be a police officer so that I could help those who at the time could not help themselves. And that's what really drew me to policing.
Wow, wow. And this little background, Monica, the reason behind Moses' People Speak is because when I do my speaking engagement, the Battle with Moses People, when I do the Q&A sessions, one question that I always get, no matter where I am or who I'm presenting to, is how come law enforcement of color don't speak out on injustice? And so now here's been my response is based on what I've been doing for the past 5 years, connecting with individuals like yourself, is I usually say they do speak out. You just don't see them on your CNN and your
Right.
your Fox
Right.
News. So can you tell me, and again, I want you to get a chance to tell your story of what was your last past year like?
So the last past year for me, I really don't know another way to say it, but it's kind of been hell on earth. And it hasn't just been this past year, it's been for maybe the last 3 years.
Wow.
So one, I want to say, yes, there are many officers that are speaking out, but you have to understand the difficulty in officers, first of all, officers at all, much less officers of color. But when officers choose to speak out, we're going against what we have called the blue code. And so this blue code is like an understood rule, basically, where being a police officer trumps everything else that you have going on in life. It trumps that you're a woman. It trumps that you're African American. It trumps that you're a parent. It trumps pretty much anything that means anything to you in life aside from you being a police officer. So that's why it's hard for officers to speak out, is because when you choose to speak out, you're not just speaking out for what you believe in. It's somehow understood that you speaking out means that you're anti-police, but that's not the truth at all. You can be pro-Black without being anti-blue. And that's where I had a lot of my issues, because in speaking out against these injustices, it was deemed with a lot of officers within my department that I just didn't like police, which of course is not true at all.
Right. And that makes a really good point. I was actually this past week I was doing I was getting a report in my own town regarding an incident that took place in State College. And part of that report, I questioned the people who were not in that room at the time. I was explaining that when we're talking about seeking justice, it shouldn't be a issue of Black or white or liberal or conservative. It should be a humanitarian issue.
I absolutely agree.
So, one of the things that I love that you touched on that is sort of, you can be pro-Black and still have the initiative to support police. So, Monica, one of the things you did mention, and I also want to touch on that too, is when you talk about the police culture, as in when you speak out, it sort of is seen as going against that police code of silence. Is there a particular incident that you sort of could think of that speaks to that?
Yes, there are. There's actually a lot. That's actually been my last 3 years.
Right.
So I'll start with the one that's most profound to me. On May 2nd of 2016, I survived in a sexual assault from another officer. We were both off duty at the time. Nevertheless, he was a male officer within my same department who was very well known and liked throughout the department and had a lot of connections that as a female officer, I just didn't have.
Wow.
And so I initially did not report the incident. That night was the absolute scariest night of my life. He strangled me and then stayed in my home for approximately 3 hours, would not leave my home. And then I was raped before he chose to leave. Wow. So it was a very traumatizing experience. And, it took a moment for me to gather myself, to put the words into the universe that this had actually happened to me. Right. And when it was reported, it actually was not reported by me. It was reported by someone who I had confided in. And their reason for coming forth was, hey, you may not be the only one this has happened to, and they need to be stopped, and right. Just to help basically preserve life or help other victims, other possible victims, said, this needs to be stopped. Something needs to be done. So I did get on board with it. And from the point that it was reported, I noticed that I began being treated very differently within my department. Wow. One of the reasons that I did not come forward and report it is because his best friend at the time was also a supervisor in our internal affairs. And, again, it's a male-dominated department. Here I am, one of very few females on our department, and even less Black females on our department. Right. So I didn't want to, it was very hard because if I report this, I'm reporting this to people I work with. And so it's different than, just being some random person reporting right. a very serious crime to someone. I'm reporting a crime about someone you all know, and I'm having to admit these things happened to me. And so being a police officer, I knew that there was a certain amount of attention that was going to get very unwanted attention, but I also knew that because I had been an officer and I've seen how victims of crime get treated as they go through the court system, I knew to some degree what this was going to look like, and I didn't want that. Okay. But nevertheless, with having to deal with the trauma and try to figure out how I'm going to move forward and piece my life back together after this terrible attack, I had to endure indifferences occurring within my own department. I would ask for time off that I couldn't get off. Meanwhile, there would be male officers who would ask to have the same time off or to have their shifts changed, and it would be granted. There were also incidents of having my shift changed when typically my off days were Monday through Friday. So I had Saturdays and Sundays off. Well, somehow it happened that me and another female Black officer, after these things had been reported for the summer, our hours were getting changed to where we had to come in like an hour earlier. And then also, instead of us having Saturday and Sunday off, we were told that we had to choose between one of us would get Sunday and one of us would have Saturday. So we had to choose between ourselves who would get Saturday and who would get Sunday. Wow. And those are things that they may sound small, but I've got children. I have a life. There's, things that we have become accustomed to that, being on the weekends has been my shift. So for our hours to get changed and for our days off to be changed, those things were just, if it were happening to everyone, it wouldn't have been such a big deal, but those things were just happening to me. Right. And of course, there's one other female Black officer who was on our unit as well. So those are some of the things that the changes that I noted more immediately, but then also I was decommissioned by my commander for saying, she said that she felt I was not fit for duty, even though just a week before she had decommissioned me saying that I wasn't fit for duty. Wow. I got a commendation from our, it's called the Gene Crow Advocacy Center here in Nashville. It's one of our centers that helps victims of domestic violence. And I had gotten a commendation from them, yet she declared I wasn't fit for duty. Of course, I underwent all the testing. They said, yes, she's absolutely fine to do her duties. So just things like that. Those are some of the things that started to happen. And through the entire experience in the very beginning, one of the most, hurtful things that happened was during that first court date, the defense attorney asked me basically he said, well, you've undergone all this training from the police department, correct? You've now been an officer. I think at the time it was like 11 or 12 years.
Right.
And I said, yes, I have. And so he asked me, well, what kind of officer was I that I couldn't get this man off of me during an attack?
Wow.
So
oh my gosh.
My womanhood was attacked. My ability as an officer was attacked. My credibility as an officer was being attacked. As an effective officer was being attacked. So when people ask, why don't officers or why don't victims of crime come forward? These are all reasons why.
Wow. Again, I can't lie to you, Monica. When I first came across your story, I it's one of those things where you would read or come across and you would say, oh, please don't be true. Where
right.
A little, because in your situation, you really are dealing with, I think, three movements, and I think we talked about this before. Again, my question, when I ask in the Battle with Moses people is, what happens when Black Lives Matters meet Blue Lives Matter? And
right.
in your situation, it also meets the Me Too movement.
Right.
And so that's really sort of sad to see that in this day and age that you would have a DA or anyone who's supposed to represent justice ask those kind of questions.
Right.
Wow. And so let me ask you, the other thing too, you also mentioned this as well, about the community support. You were someone who supported the idea of, I think it was
community oversight.
Yeah, the community oversight. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yes. So again, as all these things happened, and let me just throw in real quick that there had also been just flagrant, outright untruths that I was being accused of from my chain of command. It had become a very hostile work environment for me. And so I had tried to report those things to several different entities. I tried to report it to our internal affairs, but as I've said, his best friend worked there, and I didn't feel like the complaint was taken seriously. Right. And then I tried to complain to our human resources department, and human resources interviewed a couple other females. On paper, the review that I got, they said that they interviewed just one other female and several different males. The one female that they did interview said that, yes, these terrible work environments do exist, and even said that she felt she had been mistreated also.
Wow.
So the women that they interviewed said, yes, these things exist. The men they interviewed said, no, it's a great working environment. And so, I had complained to everyone within the police department that I knew to complain to, yet nothing was being done. And the straw that broke the camel's back for me was that just before the trial, the district attorney's office decided to offer a plea deal in lieu of trial, because they said that a high-ranking police official had came forward and said that I had a reputation for being untruthful and that I was not reliable. Well, those things weren't true at all. I'd never been under investigation for being dishonest. I'm a very reliable officer. I had all of my years for my evaluations were all very stellar evaluations, with the exception of the second to last year after I had made complaints to human resources and to internal affairs. So then our human resources looked at the evaluations and they said, oh, hey, you do have a point here, because I felt like the bad evaluations was retaliation. And I said, hey, this isn't correct. They've changed information here. It's absolutely false. What can be done about that? So they did an investigation and they said, you're right. These things do need to be changed. Well, to my knowledge, to this day, those things have never been changed.
Wow.
Human resources acknowledged that they were inaccurate statements that had been changed without consulting my direct supervisor, who was also the woman who said she had been mistreated as well. And no one has been held accountable for those things.
Wow.
So as I'm looking at all these different things, in the midst of that, I received a discipline packet for one of the things that I felt was very frivolous. And actually, there was a lot of untrue parts in it, where they claimed that the day before the plea was offered, that I had conceded to a whole host of charges. Well, that wasn't true, because the plea was offered on, I believe it was January 5th of that year. And so the paperwork said that on January 4th, I had conceded to a ton of charges. Well, I was out of the country on January 4th. So I certainly did not attend a meeting, and I certainly did not concede to charges that were false, that, that were not true.
Right.
But I didn't receive this paperwork. I received it maybe in error from the actual commander 20 days later. So when I realized what this paperwork said, it made sense that the DA would think, oh, well, she's conceded to these charges. Maybe she's not telling the truth. Maybe she's not reliable. But the fact of the matter was that the meeting where they said these things happened, that meeting never happened. Wow. So at that point, I'm thinking, I don't know who I can go and speak to, because to me, from my view, it looks like obstruction of justice. They kept this from going to trial. It looks like intimidation of a witness. If they're saying these things, now I'm afraid to, what do I do from this point? So at that point, I saw that there was a movement going for community oversight, and they were very big on police accountability. Right. So I reached out to the director and I said, hey, this is what's going on. I have this evidence. No one within the police department is willing to listen to me and take these things seriously. Right. What can I do? And they said, for years, we've heard about injustices occurring within the police department, but we've not ever had anyone to this date come forth and say, these are the exact things that are happening. And we've certainly not had anyone that said an officer that said, we would support community oversight openly. And I said, well, at this point, I feel like they're trying to destroy my name. So my choice is either allow their lies to destroy me, or come forth and boldly speak this truth. Right. So that's how I got on board with community oversight. And I'm absolutely for police accountability, because my experience, and also I have tons of friends that are officers who could attest to the fact that police do not do the best job in policing themselves. If that was the case, we wouldn't have so many unchecked acts of violence against people of color, against marginalized communities. There wouldn't be such thing as over policing, if police were able to police themselves. So I thought it was an astounding idea, and I jumped on board.
And what's interesting is I was talking about this last week, and one of the things that I'm hoping to bring to our community is something very similar, where there is an advisory board that looks at not just injustices in the community, but also within the police department. And the other part go ahead.
Yes, and our community oversight board here, they're able to do the same thing as well. We also have a board here in Nashville called the Human Relations Commission, who I will say there was at least 2 representatives from the Human Relations Commission. They're under the mayor's office here. One who still reaches out to me even to this day. And I remember when I first got her email, and again, I didn't know what to do. So I sent her, I guess she actually came into contact with me because I had written an open letter to the mayor on Facebook. And then I reached out to her and just sent her a link to it. She read the story and she called me and she was like, Miss Blake, I just want you to know that there's so much power in your truth. And so for me to have someone who actually worked for the city to say, not only do I believe you, but I'm going to do anything that I can to do something about it, that was a big deal for me, because up until that point, no one was willing to sit down to hear me out, and to take action. And even at the end of my open letter, I begged the mayor, someone of influence has to be willing to do more than nothing in order for real change to happen. And so this whole time I had been looking for someone with enough power who was willing to do more than nothing. Never really got that to come to fruition within the city. But as I said, with the oversight board, I saw at least a group of people who were willing to confront these hard conversations, willing to confront these hard truths. And then not only willing to confront them, but then advocate to have something done about it. And that meant the world to me.
Right. And that's absolutely wonderful. I'm hoping that kind of community interaction could sort of spread throughout the country. The other part. So, no, Monica, my other question too is, and you sort of touched on this a little bit too, but as a female police officer, I mean, with the many years of experience that you have had on the force, what advice would you give someone who is entering law enforcement?
So for someone who is entering law enforcement, not just as a female or as an African American, but for anyone entering law enforcement, I would challenge them to stay true to themselves. If you're getting into this profession for the right reason, then you've got a heart to help people who are unable to help themselves. So the first thing I would do is challenge people to stay true to who they are, to their real values, so that they can go in and do a job well done. Also, and I don't really know if this is something that people are as open to, but I had a conversation.
I
know, right? So I had a conversation just earlier today about some of the big issues that we have in the country with policing and communities. And so often you hear departments say things like, oh, it's training. Oh, we train well, or it's an issue of training. Well, here's the bottom line. Policing is just the culture of police work is dominated by male, white figures. So if you take male, white figures and you expect them to go into marginalized communities and police those communities, they have to be able to understand the culture. And I can even say, as a female African American who grew up in a small town here in Tennessee that did not have a lot of African Americans, there was a ton that I had to learn even about my own culture. I went to Lipscomb University. Lipscomb University is a small private Church of Christ school who did not have a large minority population. So for all of my upbringing, I did not have a lot of exposure to my own culture. Of course, like we have family traditions and things like that, but as far as my culture as a whole, I did not know. So I would encourage officers who are not people of color, or people who even are of color but are not well versed in all of the aspects of their community, especially the communities that they're going to be policing. I would advise them to somehow merge yourself into the culture so that you have a better understanding of what is important to the people that you're going to be working around. See these people as actual people, as opposed to suspects or subjects, or just other people who you're tasked with the job of policing. So you have to be willing, you have to take the initiative yourself to go into these communities and to get to know the people as people, so that you can make a difference and see these people as your neighbor. You can't take someone who's never been immersed in a culture and expect them to see someone who they don't understand as their community member, because that's not their community. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely, and it goes back. And again, I've heard this over and over again from past guests, and also with communicating with police officers. The the idea of being a part of the community that you serve, not
Right.
just showing up when things are bad, but also being there. And here's what I actually challenge. So one of the cool things I get the chance to do is actually train police officers. And
Right.
when I talk to them, I always challenge them to. I say you may not be able to change the narrative of someone who has had a adverse interaction with law enforcement, but you definitely can add to that narrative.
No,
So
you're right.
I
You're
usually
right.
I tell officers, I say, how think about how can you add to that narrative. So going back to that, Monica, I think that the thought of being able to speak out, being able to immerse yourself into a community, really speaks to the what people should be going into law enforcement to do.
Right.
Um, you
I
know,
agree. Can I offer a short story?
absolutely.
So, as I said, even when I became a police officer, there was a lot that I just did not know about my own culture.
Right, right.
Um, and so early on, I went back and I got my master's degree. That was in special education. Well, I
Mm-hmm.
had started to hear a little bit about the school to prison pipeline and
Right.
realized that it had a lot to do with illiteracy, and
Mm,
children just not understanding what they were doing in the classroom. So I started volunteering at different reading clinics. And then I decided to go to um, a reading clinic, which was in one of our roughest parts of
right.
town. And I did this as I had very small twins. I've got a set of twin boys. My twins were still in carriers, and my daughter at the time was maybe around 5 years old or so.
Okay.
And of course, these things were done off duty. So it's nighttime. I'm in the middle of the projects. I've
Mm,
got both hands tied because I'm carrying my children in their carriers, my twins in
wow.
their characters. And I've got this little girl with me, my little pride and joy. Um, and at the time, I had been doing this reading clinic for a couple of months, but I had gotten to know the families who were in that community because, if a child is coming to get help with reading, they're not just coming by themselves,
Right.
they're coming with their families.
Right.
So I had gotten to know a lot of the people in the community, but they also knew that I was a police officer. Well, there was this one kid who, at the time, I was working inside of a middle school. There was this one kid who, when I say he did not like the police, this kid
In middle
did
school?
not like the police. Oh, yes.
Oh
Yes. But
wow.
see, by the time a lot of these kids get to middle school, you have to think they've had adverse interactions, be it they've seen their parents get locked up, they
True.
themselves may have
True.
been locked up. If they're living in low socioeconomic communities, people who they care about, they've seen locked up. So
Right.
these middle school kids, they're dealing with a lot, even the elementary schools. But at this time, I was working in middle school.
Okay.
So one of my middle school students, who I've already said, did not like police at all. Well, I realized he was getting in trouble a lot while he was in class, and he would do things that seemed to get intentionally kicked out of class, where
Mm,
then the school administrators would call me to come and intervene.
wow.
So I ended up developing a relationship with this kid, um, who, when I say was sweet as pie to me after he got to know me. But
Right.
before he knew me, it would be nothing for me to walk by him in the hallway and for him just to scream out "F the police." Like that's,
Wow. Oh my
I
god.
mean, that's how he felt. That's how he
Oh
felt.
wow.
And so, um, but then after, when I first started pulling him out of class, um,
Mm,
I would let him know that, hey, I understand that you're seeing this uniform, but I need for you to see me as a person
wow.
before you see me as an officer. I
Wow.
need for you to see me as a mom, See me as someone who's trying to help you before you see me as just someone who's appeared before you wearing this uniform.
Wow.
So this kid, one night, it was probably, I know it was dark. It was dark. I don't want to put a timestamp, but I know it was dark when we were leaving the reading clinic. And as we're leaving, as I said, my hands are tied. I'm carrying my sons. My daughter's walking beside me. I'm trying to get to my keys to open up the car door.
Right.
And I see two men approaching me with masks on. And I could tell at least one of them had a gun.
Wow.
Again, my hands are tied because I was trying to make connections with the community. I didn't have on a uniform. Again, this is in my own time. I'm not at work.
Right.
And I'm not going to lie, I was afraid about what was going to happen.
Right.
In this moment, I had no idea what was going to happen. But then I heard this voice yell out, "Yo, not this one. Not this one. You can't touch her. Not that one. That's Miss Blake. You can't touch her."
Wow.
And, in hindsight, that child, I didn't know who it was until after he came on down the hill and he was like, "Miss Blake, man, my bad."
Oh my.
They were about to get me.
Wow.
Like, I was about to get got. Pardon the improper English.
No, yeah, you know what that means here.
Right. Like, I was straight about to get got, but because of the relationship that I had built with this child, because of the relationship that I had built with the community, because I had, for lack of better terms, forced him to see me as a person outside of my uniform, that night potentially saved not only my life, but the lives of my children.
Wow.
And so that is when I learned the real benefit of being a part of a community.
Right. Wow. That's, what, talk about changing a kid's narrative to being, say, F the police, to actually be able to see you as a human being.
Right.
That's wow. That's so important. I think that, the last episode that I had, I talked about when I was doing a training, or when I was being trained to the volunteer in the prison system.
Right.
The person that was doing the training referred to the inmates as animals, and sort of that mentality. And I remember leaving that training thinking, this is part of the problem.
Right.
When you have folks who do not see the people who they serve or interact with as a human, then that's when we actually have this discourse,
Right. And I absolutely agree. Kind of to the same point that I was making before, if you only submit officers to these situations that have not been in these situations before with people of color or in marginalized communities, if you take these male white officers and say, "Hey, this is what I want you to go and police," and the only interaction that you have with them is that you see they're talking loud, you see that they're using their hands, you see that there is some violence, you see that there is drug use, that these are the people that you're arresting, people that you're constantly seeing only doing wrong, well, then what do you expect them to think about these African American communities? Right. What do you expect them to think about these marginalized communities? So you have to be willing to expose yourself to deeper levels of community before you can just say, "Oh, hey, we gave them 6 months of training. We had them, read a book." When I came through the police department, one of the books that we were using, and the name of it escapes my mind at this time. Is it on my bookshelf? I don't have it right here with me. But one of the books that they were using essentially taught how to profile.
Wow.
I mean, the officers who I went through the academy with, that if that was the knowledge that they had, if that was the only knowledge that they had, then how are we really expecting them to go out and speak to the communities that they're policing.
Right.
You know?
Right.
So I think to answer your question, we have to be willing to do more work to be more successful. We can't just say, hey, we sent them through training and think that's enough. You have to be willing to do the work, and it's going to be tireless work. It's going to be unpaid work, you know, but if you really have a heart for policing, you have to be willing to do the things that are going to make a real difference.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you know, I think all the points you're making is right on. You know, it's really important that when people are and I say this in lieu to what I was doing this past week. We were talking about the training that law enforcement get, and we were specifically addressing training with dealing with mental health crisis, um, and also those with autism.
Right.
I was explaining that one thing that I understood about the training that they received is that the police was trained for safety and security. They weren't trained as counselors or what have you not.
Right.
And the problem with that is when you're dealing with a crisis, there's an extra level of care that is needed, um, and so that also applies to when you're dealing with either low SES or those with minority backgrounds, is to understand that there may be a need to do a little bit more.
Oh,
Um,
I absolutely agree.
you
I
know,
absolutely agree.
the other thing that I address, and maybe you can address this too, Monica, and I'm gonna be conscious of your time too, but maybe you can address this too. I always tell police officers or anyone in law enforcement that so you may have to also address what I call generational trauma. Um,
Oh,
and
absolutely.
and
Absolutely.
this goes back to your story when I wasn't saying I was shocked, but when you mentioned a middle school person, you actually said, you know, you got to understand that they may have seen their parents or they, you know, whoever had an adverse interaction with law enforcement.
Right.
What advice would you give to police officers for addressing generational trauma?
The first thing is don't be dismissive.
Mm,
Um, you know, because a lot of times people seem to think it's okay. When I say
mm-hmm.
people, I mean officers seem to think it's okay just to dismiss the fact that, oh, well, they just don't like the police because they've been taught not to like the police.
Right,
No, no, that's not always the case.
right,
Or, you know, they don't like the police just because they're Black. No, that is not the case.
right,
You know, prime example, both for my twins, you know, their father was a police officer. He's now retired.
right.
I was a police officer. We were a very, very pro police,
Wait,
you know, high five for fight.
you had a
Hmm?
situation. You had mom and dad police officers.
Yes,
Oh man.
for my children. Yeah, so
Right,
for my
right.
children, um, you know, with my twin boys, both their dad's a police officer. I'm a police officer, you know,
Gotcha.
and one of my favorite things to say, like when before things just got terrible for me, I would walk around saying high five for fighting crime. Kids at my daughter's school would call her an op, and she would be like, "I'm so proud about that." So you know, I mean, like we were advocates for police. They
Right,
saw us being a part of something bigger than ourselves, and something, you know, that police basically supplied our livelihood.
right.
Um, well, in the same manner, they've also seen how terribly I have been treated by a police structure that was
Right.
supposed to be my support system.
Wow.
So, without me ever saying anything negative about the police to them, my children now are terrified of police. They don't
Mm,
trust the police.
wow.
Um, my daughter has even said, you know, that if something happens, she doesn't know that she could, in good faith, call the police
Wow.
because she's seen the way that they treated me when I called upon them for help.
Wow.
Um, you know, so when you talk about generational distrust, Those things are very real. That's not something that's taught. That is something that stems from people's experiences. So the way I would respond to that would simply be to say, believe people when they say that they have these adverse experiences, when they automatically don't like you off the bat. You can't take that personal. The student that I had who, did not like me before he ever even knew me, I couldn't blame that on him because I knew that was something that had to stem from some event, some experience that he had been through. So it was up to me to make sure that he saw me as more than just a person in a uniform. It was up to me to make sure that I could somehow bridge that gap. And I understand that, if you're in the middle of a crisis call or in the middle of an emergency, you may not have time to make that connection, but you do have time to be empathetic. You do have time to listen and to try to understand before you are understood. I also think sometimes officers try to make things about a power struggle. It shouldn't be a power struggle when you're dealing with people in the public. They are people just like you are. So you have to try to hear them. You have to try to understand where they're coming from before you just project what you want onto them. So I think a little bit of empathy and a little bit of understanding can go a long way when you deal with people who have adverse feelings about the police.
Wow. Well, Monica, you have been an amazing guest to have on the show. I want to give you sort of the last word, and I usually give my guest the prompt here. I already asked you the question about what you want to see from future law enforcement entering the field. So maybe I'm going to twist this question around now and sort of go off script and ask, what do you hope? What do you hope law enforcement? I guess. What do you hope that as far as the culture go? What do you hope for the change that happened in law enforcement? What would you like to see happen?
More than anything, I hope that police culture becomes more inclusive. I hope that officers across the country are able to understand the fact that you can be pro police and pro your culture. I think that's huge because so often, if you want for someone to come through and say Blue Lives Matter, to me, what that means is the life of a police officer is worth more than any other category. Versus when you say something like Black Lives Matter, well, we're not fighting. Police officers aren't having to fight for that platform of respect, for that platform of equal treatment. That's something you sign up to do, but you can't help how you're born. So I would hope that the culture of policing becomes more inclusive. I would hope that they become more understanding, but you have to do more than just talk about it. And I think that's been the problem for quite some time, that so often, departments will say the right thing, but what are you doing to get there? Of course, it's great to be able to further the conversation, but at some point you need to stop talking and start doing the work. So I would hope that departments across the country would take people more seriously instead of dismissing their real concerns and move forward into action and lasting change. I think people deserve that.
Wow. Well, Monica, thank you for your time. You have been a wonderful guest. And again, I'm hoping to bring you out here. I think you already agreed to do that. So, but bring you out here. Our mutual friend has volunteered to be your host if when you arrive, and I told him I'm gonna hold him to that.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Well, Well, again, thank you again for your time. And guys, remember to speak power through truth. Everyone have a good night.